So hi everyone. I'm Kushal Patel, and I'm a student right now, and I'm doing my post graduation. And we have Natalia here. Natalia Burina is a AI product leader at Facebook. In 2017, she was recognized by Business Insider as one of the most powerful female engineers. Before Facebook, Natalia was director at uh like at Salesforce, where she led the Einstein and at the Salesforce AI platform. In 2015, Natalia founded Parable at creative photo network feature by Apple, and which was at the number one spot for photo, video, and social networking. And then it was bought by Samsung. Before Parable, Natalia worked on the eBay search and Microsoft search engine Bing. Natalia started her career as a software engineer after having completed her bachelor's degree in applied and computational mathematics at the University of Washington. So the stage is all yours, Natalia. You're most welcome.
Thank
Start.
you. Thank you. Good morning. Actually, it may not be morning where you are, but it's morning where I am. Super excited to be here today. Yeah, again, my name's Natalia, and I'm an AI product lead at Facebook. You may be wondering what an AI product lead is. I support a team of AI product managers at Facebook. We use artificial intelligence to supercharge, improve, and create products for lots of users. So true story, in the early days of my career, I started out as a software engineer, and when I moved over to product management, my mother was heartbroken. When I told her I was switching, she thought product management was this like fluffy thing, and she wanted me to be an engineer. So anyway, how did I get here? Well, I studied math, and machine learning is really just 90% math. And after all, the simplest version is just fitting data to a curve. As mentioned, I also built AI products at a bunch of different companies over a decade, more than a decade, starting at Microsoft, where I worked on web search in 2008. Of course, web search is a classic AI product. You have to rank results, you use natural language processing, and so that was the beginning of my foray into AI product management, which I absolutely love. I'm super excited about, and I find it's a joy every day to work in this field, and an enormous privilege. So just, software is eating the world. We are in a very interesting time today. Technology is changing how we do everything and how we experience the world. So software is eating the world really means software finally works and can be widely delivered at a global scale. So at Facebook, we have 2 billion users posting 100 billion times a day. The scale is just enormous. It's huge, and it means that there are some very unique AI challenges that we have to work with. Of course, AI has been around for a while, but now it's finally reached maturity because we have more data than we've ever had before. We have huge increase in compute power, and 3, we have relatively minor but important technical advances in deep learning, deep networks, etc. Been around for a while, but again, supercharged because we have more data and compute power than we've ever had before. So we've seen enormous progress, and the field it's growing, and it has an incredible future. And so we're going to see more AI everywhere. Many systems have even human-level performance on some tasks, which is just mind-blowing. So we've taken some older ideas and accelerated them. So again, AI, super powerful new technology. It has really enormous impact, and it changes how we do things. And because this is the case, we have a great responsibility that comes with building AI. We have an opportunity as well to show that we can get ahead of major problems and concerns. So the way that I think about, responsible MLOps and responsible AI, I like to borrow from medicine, where there's the Hippocratic oath that states, "First, do no harm." So likewise, as AI practitioners, we really should think about how do we ensure that we do no harm for our users and our customers. So that's, sounds cool and everything, but still a little bit vague. So let's get down to the business of defining what we're talking about when we say responsible MLOps. So to formalize it, first of all, MLOps increases automation and improves the quality of production ML but then the responsible part of it is ensuring that we do this in a way that's ethical, transparent, private, accountable, and reliable. And wow, that's a lot of words. What are we talking about and why does it matter? Well, AI needs to be fair to all those that it impacts. When we talk about transparency, we're really talking about explaining AI, understanding how decisions are made. And this is incredible. It sounds, maybe it sounds kind of obvious, but with neural networks, it's difficult for people who build them, of course. And so here we're talking about some novel methods of explaining AI, even to ourselves, to people who build it. Super interesting area of explainable AI. 3, we have to preserve people's privacy. So there are some unique and interesting challenges that happen with privacy and ML. I'll get to those a little bit later. For how do we ensure that we're accountable? How do we have systems that are governable and auditable through human oversight? Again, I don't want to rush ahead, but it is really important to have a certain level of hygiene when we're building AI, because if you don't, you basically end up building AI that has unintended consequences, and it sort of becomes the Wild West of development. 5, and the number 5 point, AI continuously performs as expected, is really about making sure that it's reliable, which is very challenging because AI is inherently probabilistic, right? So how do you guarantee that you have kind of repeatable outputs? How do you make sure you don't get drift, etc.? I'll get into more details as we talk about all that stuff. But the whole point of this slide is, first of all, let's formalize what we're even talking about. And as you see here, there's already a lot to think about. Each one of these points is almost a subfield in and of itself. But if there's one thing I want you to keep in mind as I'm going through this presentation is these are all things that you should intentionally think about. And if you can't focus on them, at least be very aware that they're important. So, why does it matter? Why is this important? What happens if you completely ignore this presentation and responsibility? Well, you're likely going to run into a number of problems. So some examples are your AI will manifest gender and racial bias. So for example, it could turn out that it's only showing ads for high-paying jobs to men, but not women. 2, it may, this goes to the reliability point in the earlier slide. It may not respond well to extreme events. So a fun example with COVID is that a UK grocery store with an online ordering system suddenly had so much traffic due to COVID that the AI thought it was a denial of service attack and shut down. So this is clearly very bad for the business and not how you want your AI to work. 3rd point, and these are just sample problems. There are so many things that can go wrong with your AI in so many different ways, but I just want to give you a flavor. AI is starting to make more and more high stakes decisions that impact people in very, very important ways. There are some examples in medicine. There are some examples where it's actually grading students. So obviously in medicine, if your AI goes wrong, it could result in a bad diagnosis, and it could be very problematic. And this is where gender and racial bias also comes into play. Is like you have to account for all sorts of people, and you don't want to end up building a system that impacts people's health in a bad way. So another example is, let's say you're talking about AI for self-driving car. What happens if it stops functioning because it can't handle fog and it wasn't built and again, another example of reliability. It has to be able to handle the edge case. And it's kind of interesting, like in traditional software development, we used to have the notion of quality and quality engineers. How we think about quality for AI is non-trivial. And this is actually and it's important to start to develop a discipline of building quality AI, and that I'll get into some of that later. But just thinking about how do you ensure you have quality for your AI systems and products is something that's really important. Otherwise, it will get you in trouble. Even if you don't care about the societal impact of any of this stuff, it's really bad for the business. So let's talk through this one a little bit. So I'm going to pick on fairness specifically. Again, I could probably talk about this subject for responsibility for hours, but let's think about, like, okay, you're doing MLOps. You want to ensure that you have fairness in the AI lifecycle. Well, how is it even possible that your AI lifecycle is not fair? And it turns out that problems could sneak in all these different pieces of the AI lifecycle. So for example, data and training, you could get historical bias, which is bias that arises when there is misalignment between the world as it is and the values and objectives to be encoded and propagated in a model. So this is something that exists anyway, but definitely data and training is something that people talk about the most when they talk about how bias creeps into the AI lifecycle. Two, if you're designing and developing, you could have aggregation and measurement bias. So aggregation bias arises during model construction. So this is something that most people are not aware of. But distinct populations may be inappropriately combined. In many applications, the population of interest is heterogeneous, and a single model is unlikely to suit all subgroups. So that's aggregation bias. You could also get measurement bias, which comes up when choosing and measuring features and labels to use. It turns out that features and labels to use are actually proxies for desired quantities. The chosen features and labels may leave out important factors or introduce group or input-dependent noise that leads to differential performance. Again, bottom line is you could introduce different sorts of bias. I know probably quite a mouthful in explaining exactly what that bias is, but you really have to be cognizant of this kind of stuff. I'll give one example for design and development that's very real. There is recent research that found that when you compress models, and you may need to compress models because you want to make them smaller and you want to make your AI work on device. So let's say you have a model, you compress it. Well, the fact that you compress the model actually amplifies bias issues in your system. So that's a real example. Going on to number 3, validation and testing. Here you could have evaluation bias. So when the testing and external benchmark populations do not equally represent the various parts of the use population, it can also arise from the use of performance metrics that are not appropriate for the way in which the model would be used. So this is where, again, super important that you have a lot of clarity on the intended use of the system and carefully think about it and think about that as you build through. I'm going to touch on just the last one, which is a prove and deploy deployment bias, which occurs after model deployment when a system is used or interpreted in various inappropriate ways. So, you know, maybe people who deploy the model don't have good documentation on what its intended use is, and then you end up using a model for something that was unintended, and that's where you start to have problems with fairness, bias, etc. Number 5, monitor and optimize. I'm really excited about this one, especially as it pertains to MLOps, because ML monitoring is sort of a new and growing area, and there's a lot of really great startups in this space, but just the notion that you actually monitor your system is incredibly valuable. And of course you can do that, you know, offline, or you can do it online, but having monitoring is incredibly valuable, and I'm just super excited about people learning about this more and building more tools in this space. So quickly to go through like a little bit more detail about what are all of the areas for responsible AI development. One, you have, I actually want to start with ethical, which is number 3. You want to make sure that the AI is fairness, and the way to really think about, you know, building ethical AI is you have to think about measuring it. So you have to think about, well, who are the people that the system is impacting, and how do I measure and ensure that these people are getting the same AI treatment as everyone else? So if you can't measure it, you can't, you're not even aware that the problem exists. 2, the area around accountability. To me, I really think about this as making sure something simple as your AI is actually documented for its intended use. So you build a model, you know what it's going to be used for, and you clearly call out what it should not be used for. Sounds obvious, but in practice, people don't do this well enough. Transparency is all around explaining AI. Again, very difficult, and you can think of transparency around, well, hey, I understand all of the pieces of the system. I actually have it documented, and I know how this is supposed to work, first and foremost. But then you can also go a level deeper and say, I'm going to use the latest AI explainability methods to really dig in and explain my neural nets, which are the hardest to explain out of all of the different AI, right? Reliability, number 4, super important. So continuous high performance, detecting things like, to get specific around what this means, like, are you detecting model decay? Are you detecting data issues? Do you have things in place to make sure that these are done correctly? Again, huge area, and that's where ML monitoring and ML monitoring tools come in really handy. The 5th area of responsible AI development is around privacy. So this is a whole super interesting area in and of itself. And some ways that you can go about keeping your AI private. Well, we have a set of techniques. We have a whole huge set of techniques that can address some of AI's biggest problems. And in particular, you can use data we never see, where each person can maintain sole control over the only copy of their information. So for example, federated learning harnesses the processing power of basically cell phones so that AI models can be trained and make inferences without requiring user data to ever leave a device. This is incredibly powerful. Of course, the technology has some challenges, and there's some trade-offs, one of which I mentioned earlier. Your models need to be very small. but super exciting because data never has to leave the device and you can do AI. Another one that I'm very excited about is differential privacy, which is a mathematically rigorous framework for anonymization of sensitive data. Very powerful, and something that we use in privacy. So let's talk briefly about, we've talked about the problems. I hope by now everyone sort of understands what the landscape and what we mean by responsible MLOps. Well, what are some solutions in this space? There's a number of them, and Facebook has Ubiquitous, which is a high-speed library for training PyTorch models with differential privacy. We have Captum, which is a PyTorch library for understanding and explaining how your AI works, where we have a whole set of different algorithms and techniques that you can use to not only explain your AI, but also debug your AI, which is extremely powerful. Fiddler is a company that provides a bunch of ML monitoring tools and also AI explainability. They're one of the big startup players in this space. There is Fairlearn. I believe Fairlearn is from Microsoft. I may or may not be right on that one, but there's definitely AI Fairness 360, which is IBM. There's SHAP. Amazon SageMaker has clarified. There are a lot of tools out there. So the tools exist. There maybe not. There's maybe one solution that gives everything, but a lot of them are out there. So future, what do you do? I actually meant to name this what you should do next. What should be your takeaway from this presentation? If there's one thing I want you to think about and kind of remember, it's please be aware of these issues. They exist and they have serious implications for people. So if there's one thing I want you to take away from this presentation, it's the awareness that these are important things that we have to think about when we build AI. If you can't measure it, you can't improve it. So it's really important to consider these problems and how they could manifest in the system. Adoption is the next steps. So how do you make sure that not only do you have the mindset, but also you start adopting the tools to enforce responsible MLOps? More sophisticated tools are emerging, so you can either build your own. You will definitely have to do some level of customization regardless. And then finally, legislation is coming around responsible AI. So especially from this administration, so everyone will eventually have to think about this and have no choice. But again, we have a great responsibility. I think we have an enormous power as AI practitioners, and we really should ensure that we're doing right by people when we build our AI. That concludes my presentation. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at NALE. And I'm going to go over to the question piece of the presentation now.
Thanks, Natalia, for the great presentation. So we have a question from Eric. So he's saying, like, going back to your slide on the bias cycle, if you are modifying your training data manually, what is your method for avoiding introducing additional bias in the edits?
Great question. If you're modifying your training data manually, what is your method for avoiding introducing additional bias in the edits? It depends what kind of bias you're talking about, and it depends on what sort of population and data. So I would say it depends. but definitely one of the things we do to when we think about this problem is we have training data, right? So you start to segment it by different types of groups, and then you see what kind of outcomes and decisions you have for those groups. I'm not sure if you're doing it manually, what this means, but we have automated systems to do that kind of stuff. And then you look at some core performance metrics for the system. Okay, great. Glad you found the the answer satisfactory. How long do we have for questions? I can't hear you, Kushal. Kushal, you're on mute.
Sorry. We have 5 more minutes. So Dave, have a question. Does Facebook have a specific way of structuring teams?
I'm not really sure how to read that question. I mean, we definitely structure teams in specific around business problems. So yeah, I guess it is Facebook specific, but it again, let's say you're talking about AI, it really depends on what what are the big important investments we decide on, and then we look at how we organize people around those.
All right. So the next question we have is, how do you determine which matrices to look at to determine biases? Is it possible monitoring tools as consideration when you are first define a project? Lots of questions coming in.
Is there a Keras team in Facebook? No, we use PyTorch only. I'm not aware of any Keras team. Do you have a process to introduce monitoring tools as a consideration when you first define a project? Some of the stuff, you know, I'm not sure how much I can talk about this stuff. So, but we do definitely have a process, and we have monitoring tools across the board, and you know, we definitely think about how do we monitor things like drift. Next question: how do you determine which metrics to look at to determine biases? Okay, so the thing here is that, you know, AI is really big, and it depends on what specific AI problem you're looking at. And what we do is we tie all our AI problems to actual product problems. So we look at how AI, which metrics to look at to determine biases. Again, because the field is so big, because first of all, I would say you start with what are the product metrics you're looking at. So it can be a variety of different products, right? Then you look at who are the different users, and then you look at how those users can be impacted. And the problem is there isn't really one canned answer for this, but you know, it really depends on the specific problem. It is problem specific. I'm gonna stop there.
All right. So I do have a quick question. So like every time we talk to our friends sitting around, if we are talking about any product or anything, right? So we just get a suggestion on our social media app. It can be Facebook or Instagram, and we have not looked around for that product in a while, or like it is a totally a new product. So how we are getting that promotion?
Let me make sure I understand the question. How do you do promotion for a new product?
Okay, no. So for example, if I'm talking about any of the product, it can be a what can we say as like a phone, mobile phone, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm talking to my friend sitting in a room. My phone is nearby. After an hour, if I go use my phone, use Instagram or Facebook, I just get that phone in the advertisement, right? At the social media. The same thing. And it has happened many times, right? So so what what is going on that? I'm always curious about it.
I will say, so I can't speak to this particular problem. I don't work on it. But it has that, you know, that theory has been disproven, and I think I'm gonna leave it at that.
I get it.
So there's a question around a split of people working on models, data ops, MLOps. Everyone works on this stuff. Yeah, so and I can't talk too much about the organization at Facebook. So sorry, I'm gonna have to stop there. Alejandra, I believe. How are you seeing the ML system evolve for responsible AI? So as I mentioned, I see the ML system ecosystem have more and more ML monitoring tools. And I see the adoption of the tools across the board for all of the dimensions I talked about, whether they're fairness, whether they're explainability, whether they're privacy, accountability, and for robustness over time. And again, going to the Amit, going back to the slide I concluded with, I think first and foremost, there's still a big lack of awareness around the problems of responsibility in AI and what it even means. So first and foremost, I think that it's important to explain what are the problems and the implications. And then what I see happening is an increase in the role of really having a more quality, thinking about quality in ML. And as part of that quality, it's really important to start adopting tools for monitoring your AI systems. First of all, identifying potential problems and then monitoring for those problems over time. And again, I'm really big on the monitoring part, and I think that this is seeing a tremendous amount of growth and will continue to as we have more and more adoption of AI. Is AutoML going to reduce the number of jobs in ML? Some jobs maybe, but I think it's going to empower people as well. Well, thank you so much. I'm gonna have to run to my next meeting, and I'm gonna wrap this up. Amit, maybe maybe I could give you my thoughts on federated learning in a different venue. But thank you so much. I really enjoyed giving the talk today, and appreciate everyone coming.
Thanks, Natalia, for a great talk. And so we'll be just wrapping this up. Thank you, everyone, for joining this talk. It was a great talk. Thank you, Natalia.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Alejandra. Bye-bye.